Thank you so much to our panelists who are carving time out of your days and lives to be here. And thank you to all of you in the virtual audience who have decided to hopefully either grab some lunch, grab a cup of coffee, and join us for this conversation. And we really do hope that it is dynamic and interactive as much as we can make it through this virtual medium. Thank you to Vanderbilt, to the Wond'ry, to the Coffee Equity Lab for inviting me to really kind of sit at the table with the panelists that I'm excited to introduce to you, but more importantly, hear from. Selfishly, and I shared this with them as we were getting ready for the prep, we've convened some of the perspectives and the personalities and the insights that I, as a coffee consumer, would love to hear from. And I hope that the passion that they have for the industry, for their particular work in it, if you're not familiar with them, comes through and infects you the way that it does me. Also, please note that when we get to the end of the presentation, we do have everyone's Instagram handles listed there. So if you want to jot those down toward the end, feel free to do so. That way you don't have to try and figure out if you have to grab them all now. As Haynes mentioned, I am Brian Gaffney, self-described as coffee adjacent because I do not work in coffee, but I do work on drinking a lot of it. I work in management consulting, but a lot of what I spend my time thinking about is how the work that I do in one aspect of my life can transfer over to another. So I spend a lot of time thinking and drinking coffee. And the idea of alternative futures is one that I've always found really, really interesting. The idea of speculative fiction was first introduced to me through the author Octavia Butler. And the notion of the alternative future becomes really compelling when there is a current state where you find yourself. There's a future state where you want to go, but the path to get from that current state to that future state may not be known, but you know that you need to do something different. So how you begin to reimagine and re-envision the reality of today, the way it plays, who has power, the way that power is transmitted, and the way that that power works through the system can all be redeveloped, and we can think through it again. But to do so, we have to, one, give ourselves permission to do it. We have to be courageous enough to do it, because it does mean that we have to disrupt some of the things that we've gotten used to. And so I'm excited to introduce you to, and they may not describe themselves as this way, but some rule breakers. So first, it is Jessica Eastoe, who's I had a chance to get to know her through the book Craft Coffee. And while there are many books written about coffee, one of the things that I appreciated about Jessica's book is that she really wrote it for the coffee lover. And she wrote it not as an edict or a manifesto where I'm going to tell you the things that you as coffee consumers need to know. But it was really a matter of inviting us into the experience, inviting us into her experience, and sharing some of those things that were important to her and therefore potentially important to us as well. And it matters as a patron, right? As a customer, you don't want to feel like you're being talked down to or someone's looking down the nose, but rather you want to be inspired. You want to be invited into that experience. And that's what Jessica does in the book, and I'm sure she'll do in conversation. Veronica P. Grimm, whom I've been following for a couple of years now, changing the game through GlitterCat. You really want to change the leverage in an industry, and oftentimes that has to be changed by the employees. We often talk about employee experience now in my traditional world, where if you want to change how you engage with the consumer, you have to change how you engage the employees. And if we always have the same person behind the counter in the cafe and having the same conversation, who was trained the same way and has the same palate or the same preferences or particularities about coffee, then the industry is going to look the same. And so one of the things that GlitterCat is doing is radically working to change the industry by changing who's participating in it and then at what level. And that's everything from the competitions to who's roasting, the kinds of skills that baristas are building, and not just in pre-pandemic times, but GlitterCat's digitition, which was amazing to watch, happened during the pandemic. And so as you watch this skill building happening when the rest of the world is shutting down, GlitterCat was finding a way to create a platform for people who are often marginalized and without voice to be able to engage in the industry. And I think, and I'll ask Veronica to make sure she speaks to it, but the second round of the digitition is forthcoming. So keep an eye out for that. And so we've talked about now engaging with consumers and engaging with the industry. But engaging at the beginning of the supply chain, the value chain, is so incredibly important. As we think about producers and the farmers that are clearly responsible for everything else that we enjoy at the end of the line, but how much access do they have to that education and that information and those professional development exercises and experiences that enable them to truly understand the value of the crop that they pick and provide for the rest of us to enjoy. And so one of the things that, two of the things that I'll speak to quickly, that Perfect Daily Grind is working on, a couple of which Julio is responsible for, is one, making information available in what I'll call the language of origin. So English may be the language of trade, right? When we think about commodities and industries, there often is an official language of trade. But making pressing, relevant, innovative content available in Spanish and in Portuguese is a priority for Perfect Daily Grind and the work that they've been doing. So as we think about all of these things that we see, in traditionally coffee consuming countries, but making sure that that information is a priority in the producing countries as well, so that the producers understand what is the true market value of my coffee, not simply what am I being paid by the importer, but what is the end customer paying for 8 ounces of my coffee. And as I start to put that reality at one end of the value chain in conversation with the beginning, then maybe we can even dispel the notion of the value chain as this linear flow and more of a network mode where we can kind of communicate with one another across it. Another operation that Perfect Daily Grind is working on is the Producer Roaster Forum. And many of us are aware of the industry conferences that happen and the importance of the networking, the meeting one another, the trading of best practices, the learning and the sharing that happens. Well, not only is Perfect Daily Grind doing that, but they're doing this and very intentionally locating these events, bringing producers and roasters together in coffee producing countries. So instead of that producer having to find the time and or the budget to be able to travel to make it to, be it the United States or Europe, et cetera, it is bringing the roasters into those home countries, making it, to some extent, leveling the playing field for the producers to be able to participate, to build these relationships on their own and have a more equitable say in the value of their coffee. So this is a little bit about whom we've convened to bring together. And I hope you're as excited to hear from them as I am. As Haynes mentioned, please do use the chat feature. We want it to be dynamic. We want it to be engaging. And with that, we'll shift from the intros and get started. So as we think about how we're going to have today's session, it's going to be in 2 parts. Part 1 is about the past and the present, right? Because we want to, again, back to this idea of the current state, we want to understand where we are today. And then part 2 is going to be about envisioning the future. And we're going to talk a little bit about why, again, it's important to have these alternative futures to which we go. But, even talking about the idea of equity and information, I started thinking about this idea of, knowledge is power and what was the origin of that. And this quote is often attributed to Sir Francis Bacon. But if you let that Google search persist for a little bit longer, I actually found that Imam Ali is actually the first person that I could find to whom this was attributed in a book that was called, and I won't attempt to mispronounce, but The Way of Eloquence. And this is important for us to hold in mind as we think about the importance of equitable access to information, education, and professional development, because we think about knowledge as power. And if that is the case, then those who have knowledge, we can then think about them being the powerful. And so if those who have knowledge and information are the powerful, then what does that mean for those who are without that access? Does that mean that they're powerless? And if so, then that is what this conversation is designed to address, to say that we're all at a point where we recognize that lack of access to education, information, and professional development has created this inequity in the market, where there is an imbalance of power, and that needs to be disrupted, not simply because it's the right thing to do, because it is, but also because the future of the industry depends upon it if we want to continue having coffee available. So with that, let's get started. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can really focus on our speakers. So Julio, to get started with you, would love to hear you talk about historically some of the formal and informal professional development that's been available to producers and farmers, coffee producers and farmers in the past.
Thank you, Brian. I think that's a great question, and I think there's not a clear answer in terms of, if we actually have proceeded to solve issues in the past that are now in the future or in the present, right? But I think I'll put 2 words to it, and it's passing from a collective professional development to an individual professional development, right? If we define professional development, being it getting courses, getting degrees within certain types of coffee professional developments, let it be Q grading, barista, producer, cupping, processing, you name it, right? I think that prior, when the coffee industry was booming, right? Let's say the first, second wave, let not speak about specialty coffee. This was led majorly by organizations and big companies that were adequately basically bringing coffee to consumers. That was it. That was bringing coffee to consumers that were looking for coffee, not anything specific about coffee, but that was it, right? So the professional development in the past came, I would say collectively because of the organizations. There wasn't much, to be honest. I think that in the past 15 years, there's been great advancement in technology, both at a producer level, at a roasting level, barista level, and consuming level, right? I think that that has come from, again, passed on from a group kind of development, right, into a individual development. And how can I turn this is producers. How can producers access information? How can consumers access information? And how all these parts of the chain are now able to individualize their professionalism, right? I can individualize my professional both online or offline, whether it's a course provided by a certain type of association, organization, and so on. So I think that is what we're looking at in comparison to the past and the future. However, I think that there's great potential and changes needed to be made both on an equitable level, right? Being accessible, being relevant, being innovative in terms of what's valuable for the industry as of now.
Okay, I appreciate the perspective, Julio. And then if we think that through, and the idea of it being available for the collective historically, now it is more about individual professional development being available for producers. And if we think about for individuals, if it was someone who was trading coffee, someone who was importing it, why do you think the structure has not been in place historically for that kind of individual professional development to be available for producers and farmers?
A big part of it, I think, is because of how coffee has been consumed in the past years, right? Back in the day, coffee was seen as a beverage that woke me up, that got me to work, right? Let's put it like that way, right? Consuming in the United States, at least, or worldwide, jump from beverages like Coca-Cola, sodas that were even medicinal at the time, right? Coffee entered the picture, and no one was looking behind the product. Nowadays, we have so many access to information that we look deeper into what we consume, right? Whether it's because of health, because of preferences, because of consumption trends. I think that that's why farmers have been excluded in such a way, right? First and foremost, as consumers look for more, I'd say, quality information or transparency in products, right? It depends how business works. So if a business works with a coffee quality that they don't want to shed a light on, right? Just their marketing aims is different. They just want to sell a different kind of product, right? I'd say that they want to exclude farmers in such a way that they're not involved. They're just a means to an end. They're basically a commodity, right? If in my commodity, I don't want to share a story and exclude my primary source of that, most probably that's going to be a natural course of it, right? However, as we turn on into specialty coffee, different waves of consumption and roasting and producing, etc., I think that that makes it available for producers to access information. Plus, it allows them to demand information, because in the end, it's not just one-way conversations, it's two ways, three ways, or group conversations. It involves the consumer into the supply chain somehow, right? So I think that's how producers have largely been, I'd say, excluded from that information source, right? Not to say that they are continued to be excluded. They are in some respects, right? However, I think we have the tools already for that to change, right? Both individually and collectively, whether I'm part of a cooperative, whether I'm an exporter, a small producer, a medium producer, a large producer. And the same goes throughout the whole supply chain for importers, exporters, roasters, baristas, and so on, right? Including the consumer.
Again, I appreciate the perspective. And if I hearing you out and I'm offering this and see if I'm getting it right, and if not, please correct me, is that as coffee has transitioned from simply being a caffeine delivery vehicle to really kind of a culinary product, consumers have become more curious, want to know more, and therefore then there's been this pull and this desire and demand to know more about the product and the producer, which is, so is it fair to say then that really the rise of specialty is part of what is creating the larger opportunity to develop greater access to information and education for producers? That is that a correct assumption?
Right. Yeah, I would say yes, specialty has a lot to do with it, right? As coffee has become more complex, that's, an opportunity for everyone to get involved in it, right? If you want to leave specialty aside, I think that, and it all depends on your definition of specialty coffee, right? But if you want to leave specialty aside, I think that consumers, regardless of whether they know, or they're aware of specialty coffee, they actually want to demand more of their products, right? Whether if I consume at a Dunkin' and a Starbucks, I buy my Folgers at the Costco and, just consume it, I might want to know a little bit more about my product.
And then, Julio, in light of that, do we run the risk of, because what we know is that specialty is some very small percentage of coffee overall, that by and large, right, commercial grade coffee is still the largest share. So when we talk about these additional opportunities, right, and access to education, information, and professional development, does that include both specialty producers and producers of predominantly commercially grade coffee? Or as the industry evolves and shifts and these opportunities become available for producers, are we running the risk of having tiers of producers where, again, some producers have access to this information and others may not?
100%, 100%. That risk is there. And I think it's something we need to mitigate. And I'm going to, put it in perspective on an example. Us who consume specialty coffee, right? We read a bag label and we see the name of a producer. Most probably we're in contact actually with a couple of producers. Let's say in my life, I've met 300 producers personally, right? What you advocate your thinking and your way of, relating your thoughts of the industry is with the producers you've met, right? However, let's say in Guatemala, if you've met, I don't know, 100 producers from Guatemala, there's 125 producing families in Guatemala. Same in Honduras, same in El Salvador. So the scope is much bigger than the producers you've met, right? And I think the majority of the producers work for commercial coffee. In the end, if, specialty coffee is 10%, that's going to be the same down in the line, right? Down in the producer end. So I think that there's a risk and there's so much we can do for producers that are not in a specialty coffee line delivery, right? Because it's their way of producing and it's okay, right? If it's profitable, sustainable for them, perfect. But we can definitely involve them at certain levels, right? And I think that the level of involvement should be independent and a decision of everyone's own decision, right? So,
yeah. And to your point, it just that even just when we get producers to the point where they have an opportunity to elect to take care, to take advantage of professional development, right? The first that assumes that one has access to it, then to be able to determine if you want to take advantage or not.
Right.
Right. And understanding that there's no silver bullet that is going to answer or address all of these challenges. We're not going to know it by the end of this conversation. We're not going to know it by the end of this year. We're not going to know it. We don't know when we will. And the likelihood is there won't be a single answer, right? There are going to be several. Even that's what we talk about is alternative futures, because the more equitable future is going to have many threads to it. But what are some of the things? And I know I talked, at a very high level about Producer Roaster Forum and the fact that Perfect Daily Grind is available in Spanish and Portuguese. But would love to hear a little bit more about how Perfect Daily Grind, right, which started in the UK, how that emerged to focus on providing content in Spanish and Portuguese and locating the Producer Roaster Forum in coffee producing countries.
Yeah, I think it was because of our involvement. I'm Salvadoran. I was born and raised in El Salvador, and our founders and team involvement in producing countries, right? The idea of PDG was actually born in South America, in Ecuador, where Henry, the founder, he was doing years of work there. He basically got in touch with coffee right then and there. So we were born with the mission and value coming from a producing country rather than we're born in a consuming country per se, because all countries consume coffee. Let's not, say that they don't. So I'd say we came from a coffee producing country in terms of where we want information access, right? we saw the huge potential and I'd say opportunity, that there was no information coming and coming and going, and information that was entering producing countries or generated in producing countries wasn't going out. That it was something that if I was a producer, I had the means to travel to a trade show back in the day. That was the information, right? There was few emails going on, no social media. So that has evolved. We saw the potential. Everyone has a phone now. Why not share information to everyone on like anytime, right? And have everyone involved. I think that has been one of the key things. Is it's not just about one person in the supply chain, it's about everyone, and how is it valuable to everyone, basically.
Okay. That's great. And actually provides a perfect segue into the conversation with Veronica, because Julio, in your description of how these decisions were made about the language in which the content was available and the location of the event, you were at the table, right? So literally, you've just made the case as to when you bring different people to the table, you start having different outcomes, right? Real tangible business outcomes. And so, Veronica, when we start thinking about the industry, would love it if you talk a little bit about just the homogeneity. And right now, if we kind of limit the conversation to the US coffee industry, some of the homogeneity, just curious as to your thoughts about kind of how that has evolved and what's been the impact of that homogeneity on the industry to date.
Well, thank you for phrasing the question in a way that shows that this goes way deeper than like this overarching question of why is diversity important? And that's what's so often asked. And I think the number of times I've been asked, like, why do we need representation? It's silly. It's silly how many times someone has asked that. And I'm sure many people here have been asked the same question. So Glitter Cat Barista, we started as a competition training program for the United States Coffee Championships, which, like many places, you see a lot of cis white men taking up space on those stages, and we don't see a lot of representation from the people that are making the coffee. The disconnect that it's a fascinating disconnect, and it's not okay, but the people that companies are sending to compete aren't the people that are making the coffee behind the bar. And so we're missing out on all of this creativity and just like I say fabulousness a lot, because we have so many people that haven't had the opportunity, whether or not they've asked for it or haven't felt safe to ask for it, haven't had the opportunity to use what they grew up with, what they've developed, the skills that they've put work into perfecting and being the coffee professional that they are. Instead, we're just seeing the same presentation kind of going on repeat. And when we're talking specifically about presentations, where over the last 3 years, a lot of organizations have come up to really address some of these gaps, these holes in getting people access to equipment, access to education, access to training. And we're starting to see more shifts. We're starting to see shifts that are happening a little faster. And it's a little wild, where some people are like, oh, I didn't know this was an issue. And that's part of the issue is we're fighting these systems that have been put in place. And to change a system from inside is really hard. And it's also really important. Because we were asked when we started is, when are you going to have your own competition? Why don't you just do your own thing? And we are doing our own thing now, because we kind of had to we shifted, and thanks for introducing our own competition. But we really stood for the first couple of years, it really was true to our mission of, we can't, if we want to see change on a larger level, sometimes you have to really force a system to change course. And sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it takes decades, and oftentimes we're still fighting all of these currents. But we're starting to see some changes on some of the pockets that we work in, and that's really motivating and energizing.
And speaking of that energy, can you share with us some of the reflections that you've heard from Glitter Cats? The kinds of things that, right, given this audience, what are the observations that they've made? What are the things that they're asking for? What are, let's assume that we have folks who are with us today that say, they're in a position to be able to help shift the conversation. What are some of the things that you might lift that you say in this group that we should be aware of? These are the things that you're hearing that you wish there might be a speaker in that room while we also protect everyone's safety.
Yeah. One of the most common things we hear from glitter cats is that when they come to one of our boot camps or when they're a part of one of our programs, we hear a lot. This is the first place they have felt safe to speak their mind or share what they know. It's the first place they felt safe to ask a question and to ask for what they need. And I think that is one of the biggest things is glitter cats come in and we tell them right away that they're like, everyone here is equal. There are instructors, there are learners, there are organizers, there are volunteers, and you are the most important person in your role. And you are the best learner that you are, and the instructor is the best instructor they are. But there's no pyramid, there's no power dynamic there. And it really empowers people who have typically not been able to be in a position of power to take ownership of where they are and to really put their education or their teaching or their volunteering into their hands. And that is probably the biggest thing that I see as being able to not just like bring people to the table, but to throw the dang table away and just get rid of it. And one of the glitter cats, she came to our in-person barista bootcamp in 2019, competed and didn't make it to nationals, and learned so much about herself during that process, and found a really unique community. And then she was always hardworking, but what she then had access to was a few more resources that she connected to through GlitterCat, and then was an MC for Barista League, is like finding out, she's like teaching herself how to roast and is starting a roasting company, is like looking at internet, is connected to a lot of international coffee communities. And it's because she finally had this space to cultivate the fierceness she already knew that she had. She's like, I know I'm amazing. I've never felt okay to showcase how cool I am. And to hear her say that was incredible.
Yeah. That kind of I think I'm hearing you talk about, it's the self-confidence, it's the self-esteem that's built, and it's the agency that gets cultivated in that incubator that is safe and fertile and protective, that then enables you to step outside of and then really pursue at a different level because you have that sense of community and that experience now. And if I can ask one more question before we shift from this part of the conversation, Veronica, is, if there was something you could ask of the industry, what would that question be? So asking kind of, what are you hearing from the participants in the programs, but even from the industry itself, what in addition to throwing the table out, but what else might you ask of the industry to prepare itself to become more equitable in providing that access?
I would ask to just deconstruct what you know, and like I'll have like 3 examples that are just really clear that like take away your idea of professionalism. Whatever it is, just throw it out. Our theme this year is F professionalism, and we're starring out the other 3 letters. And it's, if you can get rid of some of these systems that we've been kind of like cultured to believe are necessary and important. So professionalism, like allow the people you work with to engage with guests and coworkers and in ways that makes them feel safe and themselves. Throw out dress codes. You think dress codes have a ton of issues, and there's a way to have a dress code that is still equitable and still accepting of everyone, starting with throwing it out. And then this idea of like hospitality standards. With all of these, you can, if you want to create your own competition or your own, like your own competition, you can create rules that are really kind of radical, and put the power in the competitor's hand. And this can be shifted into like a cafe situation. And I'll give one quick example. And it's going back to professionalism, where the competitors self-defined what professionalism was to them. And then the judges had to judge their presentation through the lens of the competitor. And so the competitors, like, professionalism to me is using a lot of music references and like singing or something. They could sing their presentation and have a lot of music references, and it was the judge's job to shift their perspective and then judge through that lens. And we saw so much creativity coming through that. And we started to apply that more and more to any of our programs, and encouraging other folks to just really think about how can you, it's kind of this cool way to take power away from judges and put it into the hands of people who don't typically have access to that power right away. Because judges aren't more important or more powerful in a competition, or a boss isn't more important than you. We all have our roles. We just need to give, like you were saying, agency to those who haven't always had access to that, even if they've tried to get access to it.
As I listen to it, I'm thinking about the idea that, as opposed to the idea of excellence being imposed upon someone, that you really have the opportunity to self-define. And then really then the role of that judge really becomes, hey, as you define your goals, then how well are you developing toward those goals that you've defined, right? And so almost there as a mentor to hold you accountable for that, which then really says, then, okay, instead of we're going to set this single finite set of rules, we're going to open it up. We're going to explore what excellence is, what hospitality is, what professionalism is. Let you decide it, because there's a great chance that how you define it, there's a community of people that's going to resonate with that, right? And it means that we're probably going to bring more people in through the doors of the cafes, right, and into coffee, because they're not going to feel like they're excluded from it. But without that freedom to be able to open up those doors and explore, even the folks coming in through the front door, start to also fit that profile, because they don't feel welcome as consumers.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then Jessica, as we come over to you, we'll continue to make our way, across the value chain and through the network. Now we're now starting to talk about the consumers themselves and who feels like they're willing to raise their hand and identify as a specialty coffee consumer, or they feel comfortable walking in and knowing how to order or not knowing how to order. There's an anecdote that I sometimes share. Is I was with a partner, walking with a partner from one of my firm, and there was a particular cafe, and he never wanted to go into that particular cafe, because as educated as he was and as professional as he was by many of these kind of standards that we were just talking about, felt very intimidated when he walked into this particular cafe and said, no, I'm just going to go here because I know how to order. I know what I'm supposed to get. And the mere idea that because I feel bad as a result of the experience means I stay away, means, again, we're doing something wrong. So, Jessica, can you talk with us a little bit about how the industry has traditionally underserved consumers when it comes to that access to information, and what some of those misses have been?
Yeah, sure. I like to make a distinction between like a prosumer who sort of is everything but working in professional coffee, and they do everything they can to get information, and they would take SCA training courses if it was allowed. That's one small slice of people. But then most consumers that I interact with a lot, they enjoy high quality coffee. They probably graduated from some of the bigger chains, and they frequent their local coffee shop, and there's a spectrum of like how engaged they are with the industry. And I think the first place that they have for access of information is that roaster or coffee shop that they're buying their coffee from. And there's kind of two things that are sort of challenging with that. One, there's a proliferation of information, and a lot of that information is inconsistent across the sort of like disparate web of coffee shops that are their marketing language is what's educating consumers. And I think that can be very intimidating and difficult for consumers to parse for a few different reasons. Coffee shops aren't always the best place to learn about coffee because they're busy and loud. Their baristas may or may not have been trained in that sort of customer service way of educating consumers. Some baristas have a very singular outlook and have a black and white, right or wrong sort of perspective on what coffee should be, which is very hard for a consumer to think, is this universally true, or is this the shop's perspective, and how do I deal with that? And I think that a lot of it has to do with this inconsistency of language. Like when you go into a coffee shop, it's sort of like you have to have a base knowledge of information to be able to order, like with your anecdote. It's kind of like you have to know what these different brewing devices are, like what's pour over, what's batch. And just in this example, like in Chicago, some shops call it batch, some shops call it drip, some shops call it filter, some shops call it Fetco, the name of the machine that they use. And like an average consumer, that's like, what are you talking about? Like if I want filter coffee and I go and ask for that somewhere, are they going to know what I'm talking about? So I think that the experience can be sort of jarring if you're frequenting lots of coffee shops and they don't use the same language. And then if you turn to the internet to find information, it's sort of all jumbled together with like information that's, has done their research and is, like Perfect Daily Grind or something like that. And then just SEO driven content from marketing companies that may or may not be like the information that the consumer actually needs, like accurate information. And there's also mainstream media that usually pops up first on search engines. And as a source for some of those articles, I can tell you that they often don't have a level of like nuance, and they end up quoting me in a way that's not what I would say if I was talking to someone, because of the time constraints and how they edit things and their lack of knowledge about coffee. So I think it's hard for consumers to sort of pare down the information and suss out for themselves like what they want to hold on to and what they want to dismiss, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's one of those things that I wonder, for many consumers, I remember even as I was going through it, I got to have a certain amount of experience before initially I was concerned about, am I right or am I wrong in my preference or a particular coffee? Am I supposed to like this? And if it's good, but what if I like it, I'm not supposed to because it's bad? Does that somehow reflect on me? And then with enough experience and thankfully able to build community, able to connect with some of those baristas who were super approachable, and we could have those conversations, finding good information online. And then being able to kind of throw the notion of good and bad out the door. And it really comes to, it's all about what I like. Right? But if I hadn't stayed with it, I could have very easily been dissuaded earlier on in my journey from this idea of self-exploration and deciding for myself based upon my palate what I liked. So to that point, Jessica, when you sat down to write Craft Coffee, what kinds of questions were you looking to answer for consumers, or information were you hoping to provide for folks?
Well, most specifically, I wrote the book for people who wanted to make high quality coffee at home using a handmade device. But I also think that I wanted to provide just sort of that foundation of knowledge for even people who didn't want to make coffee, but who want to feel confident, ordering from coffee shops, or sort of that insider lingo. So I got the idea because I like specialty coffee, and my partner was in the coffee industry, and I would spend a lot of time at the cafe, and there was like a disconnect with me sitting on one side of the bar and the other people who I were friends with on the other side of the bar, and they had some kind of knowledge that I didn't have, or they spoke a different way than I would have spoken if I was explaining it to someone else. So I really tried to do that in the book, just sort of explain everything and give people the tools they needed to make sort of their own decisions, and to give a sort of background information. And I hope I did a good job about what specialty coffee is, or what I call craft coffee.
And actually, Jessica, to that point, can you talk about how you came to use the term craft coffee? Because I think when I first read it, that was one of the things that I immediately connected with. And I know it's also an interesting topic that's kind of in the ether right now, because the Specialty Coffee Association has just come out with a new definition. So can you talk a little bit about how you landed on craft coffee and why that term worked for you?
Yeah, I think it was because when I was first starting to write the book, the term third wave coffee was really popular. And as a consumer, like that didn't really connect with me, and it didn't seem to make any sense. And it seemed out of step with, like, I see specialty coffee in line with like craft beer and wine and other, high-end products. And it just seemed to miss a lot of the nuance that sort of was the reason why I like specialty coffee. And a lot of it had to do with it being small and a craft, because a lot of the producers that made the coffee I was drinking were relatively small. And the shops I was buying from were, independent shops. And the batches of coffee that they roasted were relatively small. And it required the skill at every level that I associate with the word craft. And I think it helps, from my perspective, people value the coffee more and understand why we should spend money on it. And when for so long, people aren't used to spending a lot of money on coffee.
I appreciate that. And I know, again, one of the reasons that it resonated for me is because the notion of craft coffee suggests that there is something to know, right? And again, how much of that you want to come to know is the decision that each individual has to make for themselves. But the idea is, but there is something that I can optimize or maximize if I spend some time learning a little bit more about it. And then final question for you right now, how would you say that consumer curiosity around craft coffee, specialty coffee, third wave has changed since you published the book back in 2017?
I'm not sure if the curiosity has changed as much as it just seems like more and more people are curious about it. And I can tell that from my position as like a book author, because like the types of places that want to sell the book, for example, were surprising to me, like Target or World Market or something, like more places that reached a more mass audience. And just the sort of on that same vein, like the types of places that sell equipment for people who want to make coffee at home has exploded like in the past 5 years. And it's very easy to access those things. And when I was first writing them, like even 5 years ago, I mean, I think there's a big difference. And I think that shows that people more and more sort of, they taste specialty coffee and they sort of move into that space as opposed to, commercial coffee or some of the bigger chains.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate that. And as we prepare to transition, and I'm not going to attempt a true recap of the conversation that we have had thus far, but I do want to call out that, as we talk about how the trends in for producers moving from the idea of collective professional development to that which is more individually driven and having the access and opportunity to do that, to shifting up and changing, who's in the cafe, who's behind bar, who's managing, who's setting the standards, and the radical impact that can have on the industry, the business, and even who feels welcome in the cafe, to ultimately the way we're talking with consumers and how confusing that can be. And we don't want to lose that as we think about what the future looks like, right? These are some of the things that we think about as we move forward. What are some of the silos we need to knock down? What is some of the language that we need to change? What are some of the standards we need to do away with? Because really they are doing more harm than good. So as we talk about for part 2, alternative futures, and why should we consider them? And so, as we get ready to hear from our panelists again, I wanted to raise this up and just ask, as we kind of tune our ears to a couple of things. One is that, as a tool, an alternative future enables you to imagine not simply kind of what was, to reframe it, what might have been, but ultimately what is yet to be. Because, I think you really have to have a sense for what that image is and then work toward it, as opposed to working from where we are today and kind of naturally moving forward in that progression. Again, we have to be disruptive. And so, again, that's the tool that enables us to envision and the freedom to think about the future differently than we might be today. Another reason to do it is it because it enables us to create a level of comfort, right, and confidence. I mean, we start thinking about the future makes a lot of us nervous for many different reasons when we're thinking about things other than the future of coffee. But if we normalize being novel and disruptive, coming up with different ideas, then all of a sudden the ideas behind what if can become broader and bolder. And as the industry is hearing them, may not be shut down quite as quickly because we now have an appetite and really a tolerance for things that ideas that are not as traditional as we expect them to be, as we think about a more incremental and linear transition. And then finally, another reason to consider alternative futures is because it's often an invitation to identify different leaders. If we think about who's working in coffee today, and if we were to all imagine 10 years from now who those leaders might be, we'd probably have a list of folks. But when we start thinking alternative futures and the scenarios look different, the industry looks different, the sources of inspiration look different, the writing of the standards look different, then the people start looking different as well. And so who it is that we're creating opportunities for advancement for, who we're inviting into the conversation, we've thrown the table out. So who it is that's coming to stand around the bar, that becomes far more diverse and far more inclusive, and for a very value-based reason, right? We're not doing diversity for the sake of doing diversity, but simply to say, if this person wasn't in the room, that idea wouldn't have come across. And if that idea hadn't come across, we wouldn't be where we are today. So a little bit about that, again, it's this idea of why considering alternative futures matters. And do keep in mind that S is intentional, because with everyone with whom you speak, they're going to have a different alternative future, and there's room for them. We don't all have to rush to have a single example of the one that we all agree on, right? But there are multiple paths to the future. So again, Julio, coming back to you in this idea of the alternative future, if we think about, I received this notion from Carl Weinhold in his book, Cheap Coffee. And he talks about the idea that many producers today are price takers. They're not price makers. And so, from your perspective, what is most urgent in terms of what information, what kinds of development, what kinds of education are important for producers to be able to shift from price taker to price maker?
That's a great question, Brian. And I think it's important, prior to answering that question, is what are the pros of being a price maker, right? Is being a price maker the top line? Oh, I'm a producer, I'm a price maker now. This is, where I want to be. And if it pertains to each producer. And here comes the answer to my question. The most urgent information, at least for coffee farmers, is I think it's information that makes them self-aware of their own supply chain, right? The majority of producers, we know, let's say Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, Ethiopia, 4 major producing countries, right? Most probably not even 80% will be price makers at all, right? However, they can improve or at least be cognizant of their own supply chains. Are they selling cherries? Are they selling parchment? Are they selling green? Within those, what can I improve to be a price maker within that supply chain? Am I a price maker with the person I sell the cherries to the mill, to the exporter? I am a price taker for that, and start from the bottom and then escalate. Because one thing is, I think that being a price maker in the utopic of I'm a stakeholder, I am a coffee farmer with 40 hectares, that's not the situation for 95% of the coffee producers in the world, right? So I think that the most urgent for coffee farmers is educating in what can I improve at my local supply chain that's going to make me be a price maker within my local supply chain, and then escalate to be a price maker at larger supply chains. I'd say that's the most urgent. One of the key things we saw for Producer and Roaster Forum, I actually had personally hours and hours of calls with producers, and the same questions arise. How can I send coffee samples to roasters? How can I speak to coffee roasters? What do they want to know? How can I sell coffee? They want to close the gap too fast. Everyone wants to close the gap too fast, but there's so many things that can be done at a local level. And what are you selling your coffee to? Who are you selling to? Are you part of a cooperative? Are you selling the coffee to a cooperative? At what price? Under what terms? Right? There's so many things that can be done at local level that I think that's the most urgent that we can do.
Okay. That's fantastic perspective, Julio. Thank you. And then Veronica, if we come back to you with the second round of the digitician forthcoming, But what are Glittercat's hopes for improving coffee service professionals' access to information and education in the future? Right. I'll force myself to leave it there because there's so many thoughts that come behind that. But really, what is that vision that's continuing to drive the programs you set up, the boot camps, and the competition? And what do you hope? How do you hope that will land, in the industry?
Yeah. So our goal is to provide a free access to education or to competitions or to events. Everything we do is free and it's accessible. We make the first thing that is on our application for the upcoming Digitution, the second round, is if you need any kind of accessibility option, whether it's a different language for the application, whether it's to compete in a different language, if you need a translator, if you don't have access to technology, if we need to get creative about how to ship you your competition kit, that is our number one goal, is that anyone can compete, anyone can join a program. And it's our job. It's our job to figure out, to work with that person to make that accessibility happen. It's not the person who needs a certain thing. So that's one thing, is we really want to see more free access to resources. Like certain coffee classes can go up to $400, $500, and most people can't afford that. That's too much money to have access to a certification. With that, we'll just leave it there. We'll leave it there for right now. And then the other thing is, I really want to encourage everyone to consider, if you as a person, if you need to take a step down and remove yourself from a space, because you can't make space without leaving it open for someone else to fill. So if you're we encourage marginalized folks to take up space. Like these spaces are for you and you should take them up. But wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to take up space, we could just exist in spaces, that we didn't have to actively insert ourselves and try and convince people that we belong here? And some of that is, most of that work is on people that are already in those spaces to just take a step back.
Yeah. And Veronica, I'm curious, in your experience, are you finding that there is a demand from roasters, cafe owners, et cetera, who are looking for talented professionals? Are they coming to you saying, we know that you are, you're training, you're educating, you're working with a new perspective? Are you finding that is it, the phone ringing and is the inbox filling up with those kinds of requests?
I really wish I could give a big resounding yes. We have a few people who have said, hey, we have this job and we want to find a different person to fill it. But it's not as much as we would like. And the few people I've had that have been like, how do I get more representation on my staff? I was listening to this nonprofit leadership lab. This podcast is called Nonprofit Leadership Lab, and it's a podcast about nonprofit leadership. And there was a whole discussion about how can you get a more diverse board of directors. And one of her main tips is to diversify the ponds that you fish in. So if you always put your job listing on like Scrudge.com, and that's the only place you have it, only people who follow Scrudge.com are going to have access to that, not people without internet. So really thinking about, if you're trying to fill like this upper level position and you'll pay a relocation stipend and like you have a lot of money to invest in finding different organizations that you can pay to have your job there. Where if you start to get creative about where your job listing is, about where you're putting your applications, about all of that, you're going to find that people are going to apply for your job that never would have seen it before. Craigslist is a great place. They put your job listing on Craigslist. There's a lot of people that are really skilled, that it's your job as an employer to invest in their education. Don't hold back education because they might only be there for a year. If you want skilled baristas, train your baristas and don't expect them to come to what really is an entry-level job in many ways with years of experience, and then pay them $12 an hour or $8 an hour or even 15. Like it's the expectations that a lot of owners and managers have. I'm not gonna say all, I'm just gonna say a lot. Like a pervasive culture is experience and underpaid. And we need to start shifting that. And that's investing in your own education and investing in your people. And if you invest in your people, chances are they'll feel safer to start asking questions and developing programs and investing and doing their job and being paid for their job, and then taking on more responsibilities and being paid for those responsibilities. And that's when you're going to start seeing some of those changes and those culture shifts and people wanting to come and work for you.
I really do like that idea. Don't hold back on education and professional development. It really, in many ways, it can become a retention opportunity, right? Again, it's the idea that if I'm working for a place that's investing in me, then I'm going to feel a greater sense of loyalty and commitment to that particular organization. So that's great. And then Veronica, we actually have a question that's come up from Brooke, just asking about other examples of places where job postings can be listed. I know you mentioned Craigslist, mentioned Sprudge, but if Brooke is thinking about how to fan out more broadly, PD jobs, yes, is another one. Absolutely, perfect daily grind. But what other, and this really is a question for all of our panelists, what other places might you suggest, folks who are looking to diversify their talent pool, where might they go?
The first thought outside of like Craigslist is get it off of the digital. So find a community job board, find like local organizations, like go to the local LGBTQ community center, and they probably have a job board. And finding other centers like that that work within marginalized communities, this idea of diversifying your ponds, print out a job application, include the pay rate on there, and bring them physically to locations. And physically to locations right now is a little tough, but you can send emails to them and be like, hey, can you share this with these organizations? Find nonprofits that work within your community. And a lot of this is things that I have spent a lot of time like intention thinking about this, and I'm still actively learning. So I'm excited to hear what the other panelists have to share here as well.
On the digital front, like I think Veronica is 100% right. Going local and offline is a solution, right? Because in the end, you're connected in person, and I think if you get to know someone in person, it's irreplaceable on the digital front. If you go online, I'd say, and LinkedIn is a great place. Not only, and let alone how you can build your profile, but how LinkedIn solutions have developed into how can you connect, fast apply, search for companies that are actually doing things right. You can see who works there, you can connect there. I think it's fantastic. It also depends on where you want to work. If it's more of a professional, if I'm going to be a general manager at a company, at a coffee shop, or I'm going to be a barista, more hands-on, right? It all depends, I think, on the nature of the job. But I think online LinkedIn is a good place to be.
And then Jessica, while you may be thinking of a response as well, I'll also get my question ready for you as well. So feel free to answer this question as well as kind of resourcing the job postings. But if I'm not mistaken, Craft Coffee was published almost 4 years ago to the day in 2017. So happy book anniversary. But I'm curious, in light of some of the changes that you've seen, in light of some of the things that, as you continue to experience as a coffee consumer, if you were sitting down today, starting to write Craft Coffee, what might you expand on? What might you add to the book that would make it different from the volume as it exists today?
Quickly, I wanted to echo something Veronica said that relates back to what I was maybe saying earlier about the cafe as like an educational resource. I think when baristas don't get paid enough and they don't have access to training, then that filters down to the consumer not having all the information that they can. I just want to make it clear that I didn't think every barista was in the position to communicate the way that I might have been talking about. And then just because my partner was the head of a cafe education department, he never valued like previous experience over like willingness to learn when he was hiring people. And I think in Chicago, a lot of cafes try to find people that live in their community to work in the coffee shops, because a lot of times, you know, the places where the coffee shops open don't hire people that may need the jobs that actually work in those locations. So I just wanted to add that as like an idea for people who have coffee shops. Not that I know anything, but anyway, so Craft Coffee published, about 5 years ago. And I think one of the big things I think about, and I'm actually writing a second book about this, is coffee flavor and tasting, because I specifically left a lot of that out of the first book. And now I think that people, like consumers, want to know more about that. And I think as it relates to education, a lot of consumers just want to be able to pick out a cup of coffee or a bag of coffee and know, like within a reasonable shadow of a doubt, that they're going to enjoy it. And one of the joys of specialty coffee is just how much there is to taste, and the depth and the breadth of all the different flavors there can be. But there's like let's think about a beer list or a wine list. Like most people who are in that space casually can look at a beer list and know reasonably what they're probably going to like and what they're not going to like. Or a casual to a little bit more than casual wine drinker will probably know if they prefer white wine, red wine, rosé, that kind of thing. And I don't know if coffee consumers at sort of this entry level and mid-level like engagement with the industry know that. And I think part of it is the language that's on coffee bags, and especially flavor notes. I ran like a little anecdotal experiment before this panel where I asked my friends, like, if you saw the flavor note s'mores on a coffee bag, what would you think it would taste like? And they said s'mores. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But like coffee, that's probably not what whoever wrote that on the bag intended. They might have, wanted to communicate that there is some level of perceived sweetness. There may be some kind of chocolate note in there, and maybe some like delicious browning, roasty notes. Mm-hmm. That's a lot different than s'mores, right? But like an entry level or like this mid-level consumer person doesn't know that. They don't even have any expectations for what flavor notes mean. And they automatically assume that if they don't taste s'mores, they either don't have a developed palate and they did something wrong, or they didn't brew it right, or whatever. And so I wonder if there's a way to better communicate these flavor type things to consumers in a more sort of, some shops do this really well already, but there's not like a uniform thing. It kind of goes back to that disparate channels of information and education that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. It's interesting how flavor can be something that's either very inclusive or very exclusive. And so the idea of how to democratize flavor, and I know that there are conversations happening in other communities about how to democratize and decolonize the flavor wheel. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this idea of flavor is a really interesting one. So yeah, we'll definitely be sure to watch for that next project and check that out. And I know as we're getting close to time, there's another question that I wanted to make sure that I address from our audience before we turn it back over to Haynes. And that is, and Julio, I'll start with you, but it's absolutely not limited to the idea that producers have been trapped as the price takers. And as we think about empowering them, and I know one of the things that you talked about was empowering them to do the best that they can locally. And I was wondering if there might be anything else to offer to this idea of self-empowerment for these producers and taking some of those steps locally. And you may have some particular steps or resources to which we might be able to point the person asking the question.
I think to break it down to a simplest is getting out of the comfort zone for each and asking your neighbor. We've seen so many situations that producers have so many producing neighbors. They're in coffee producing regions, and they're not aware of how it operates for their neighbors. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It depends on the country as well. For example, Honduras, I think I mentioned this earlier, but Honduras has a very cooperative based supply chain locally, right? There's a lot of co-ops in Honduras, and the way is they are 100% aware of what's happening in their area, maybe in the area a couple of kilometers away, right, miles away. So I think one of the key steps is asking. Information is going to give you the knowledge to take better decisions, informed decisions. Is this okay for me? Is this not okay for me? Doing a retrospective. If you want to go out and let's say not local, is doing a little bit of investigation, right? How, let's say, social media articles, getting aware of how coffee is being consumed. Am I aware of where my product is going? How is it being consumed, right? If I produce coffee, how do I know, if there is being an espresso? Is it who the company I work for is? How are they marketing the coffee that they're selling? Because if they're buying my coffee and they're marketing coffee, is that something I resonate with, right? If not, like I think being, again, cognizant, self-aware is a power tool, right? And if I would put it into answers, is investigate online and offline, chat with your neighbors, ask questions, right? Online is investigate, search hashtags, whether in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Chinese, and whatever language you speak, it's relevant to you. Search website, read around what's happening. In the end, regardless of if I read a newsletter, a blog post, they're trying to communicate me something, right? So reading between the lines as well, because in the end, marketing is something they want me to hear, not what I want to hear, right? So I think reading between the lines is a good exercise. Investigating as much as possible. It's a good exercise for everyone, for producers and anyone in the supply chain.
Thank you for that. And then I know as I get ready to hand it over to Haynes, I'm just going to acknowledge and ask, so Will is asking, is there a good primer that consumers should read? So maybe what I'll ask each of you to do is to maybe take 10 seconds and offer, a resource that you find really compelling. And then once you all share that resource, Haynes, I'll turn it back over to you. So maybe we reverse. Jessica, I want to start with you. Maybe your go-to resource.
You could buy my book. I hate saying that, but it is a primer on specialty coffee, except not espresso. But I think another really accessible resource is James Hoffman's YouTube channel, which maybe a lot of you already watch, but I think he does a really good job as a professional speaking to consumers. So if you are a consumer, that's a good place to start, but there's tons of other outlets too. So let's hear from some other people.
Thank you, Jessica. Veronica, what about you? Any suggested go-to resources that you might suggest?
I love James Hoffman's YouTube channel. Casey Makes Coffee on Instagram. She is really like pushing the boundaries of what coffee is and how we can explore it in a new way. Barista Life LA also on Instagram. Those are the two Instagram handles. She's also doing some really amazing educational things and just breaking down what coffee can be. James Hoffman also has a book that you can take a look at, The World Atlas of Coffee. But I think like really kind of like paging through some Instagram pages is there's some amazing stuff there right now.
Indeed. Thankfully, it's not a dearth of content that we're struggling for right now.
No.
And then Julio, when not on Perfect Daily Grind, what other resource might you recommend to our audience?
If we're on Instagram, any Instagram profile for a more B2C kind of, if you want to learn about brewing recipes, what products are coming out, updates, I'd say Instagram. If you want a more industry insight level, I go to LinkedIn or Twitter, definitely. The conversation is very different. Me personally, if I'm on LinkedIn, I'm like in a different mindset. It's like, oh, I'm a professional, quote unquote, right? I'm diving into the insights of things. I'm more numeric, more statful. I go to Instagram, I want videos, I want to see what's brewing and so on, right? So those two. And if you want to go to a more commercial kind of approach and learning, is newsletters. A lot of newsletters with updates from the companies themselves, from organizations and so on. That's, you know, because it's emails, right? And they're putting the important stuff there. So newsletters, another way.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so very much for all of this perspective, the insight, the opinion, and, you know, boldly stepping into some ideas that we might know, you know, we might not be as forthcoming about as maybe we should be as we think about shifting the audience. And Haynes, again, thank you so much for the time and the space to have this conversation.